What is up, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Tattoo Critiques. This week we've gathered a few tattoos that could use a little bit of work, so we're going to dive a bit deeper than normal and see if there's anything we can pull out of these that can help you guys create better tattoos. Y'all ready? Let's get into it. All right, the first tattoo we have sent in is from David Lowe. And David, you sent in this portrait of an older gentleman. I'm not sure exactly who it is. It could be somebody famous or somebody's grandpa, I'm not sure. But at first glance, this is pretty solid. I'm going to critique this tattoo the way that I would approach a portrait, and that's from the bottom to the top. This is a pretty standard method of tattooing realism, just so you can work in all the finer details without smearing the stencil. Starting from the bottom, the very first thing I see is this hard edge. Normally, I wouldn't be a fan of how you approached this, but you did mention that this is going to continue on to something else. So I guess I would have to wait and see what you did with that. However, if this were a standalone portrait tattoo, then here's my suggestion on how you can end this a little bit more soft without having that hard edge. So what I'm doing here is extending those darker shades a little bit, pushing out those lines, and then I'm going to dilute the black with a little bit of water so it kind of blends into the skin tone a little bit nicer. Having that softer edge, that skin tone blend into the tattoo makes it a bit easier to add on to something else in the future. I know you mentioned you're going to add on to this tattoo, so there's going to be something on the bottom. But a lot of times we're given references that cut off a bit too early. So in that case, this is something that might work. I do think you pretty well nailed the bottom mouth and jaw area. There are a couple spots I think you could have used a little bit of work, and that would be the heavier dark areas in the cheeks. I think you could work on finessing those mid-tones and light tones a bit more, just to make those curves along those wrinkles a bit more realistic. The same thing could be said for that right side of the nose. You have that line that runs all the way down. If you look at the reference, there's not really a hard line. It's very soft and almost invisible. I think the line in the jaw is a bit strong as well. It just kind of looks like a random line from your tattoo machine and not so much a soft wrinkle. Keep in mind, adding wrinkles with a liner always adds age. That's because those lines are more defined and it makes you focus more on the wrinkles than anything else. If you use a mag, you're allowing it to appear a bit softer. For example, the eye wrinkle that's coming off of the bridge of the nose. It looks too much just like a line and not enough like an actual soft wrinkle. Had you used the side of a mag and kind of just push out toward those highlights, again, it would have just made it a bit more believable. There's a couple small areas under the left eyebrow that I think you could have darkened in a little bit just to push that eye back a hair further. And on the right side of the eye, I think you just went a little crazy with the dots because it doesn't really come off as hairs. It just kind of looks like polka dots. Moving to the left side of the tattoo, where you have this tuft of hair. What you've tattooed kind of looks like it's just waving to the left, whereas when we look at the reference, the tuft kind of comes down first and then back into the left. And it does seem like you have a lot of skin tone showing through and not enough shades or areas of shades to kind of hide that skin tone. I know his hair's thinning, but it's not supposed to be that thin. Same thing with the top part of that hair. You just have too much skin tone showing through the backside to where it doesn't really give it enough volume. It just looks like a scalp is showing all the way through. Now that being said, this gets a little bit tricky when you come toward the front of the head where you have these very thin lines of hair. If you look in the reference, those lines are barely there, and I'm sure they probably showed up a little bit more in person rather than the photo that I was sent of the reference. But keeping those thin lines there without anything else just make his hair look very, very, very thin. I know the reference has a bright highlight in that area, but I think you should mimic that highlight as much as possible. Kind of tone down on those hairs just a bit. Hopefully those lines do heal a little bit lighter, and if they do, it would just make it appear a lot more like a highlight and a lot less like super thin hair. And one last thing, to me the background just cuts off a bit too early. It kind of seems like the background is just a crutch for those heavy highlights on the top. I see this in a lot of tattoos, where artists will use this shade kind of just to show shape on extreme highlights. Make it feel like that background is part of the environment instead of just some random placeholder. Push those midtones out a bit and blend them in with the skin tone. Give it some organic shape instead of just leaving it off rounded like a black halo. So for the most part, I really think you've got the hang of it, but I think you're lacking the finesse it takes to work in those mid and light tones. You have to put in the same amount of time on those lighter areas as you are on those darker areas in the shadows. Also, try to dial back using an outliner so much in those subtle areas of the face. They just become too stark and my eyes get drawn away from everywhere else. As I've said before, outlines in realism is extremely important. You just have to know how to hide them, because right now those outlines are just a little too exposed. Well, thank you so much, David, for sending that in and letting me talk about it. All right, the next tattoo sent in is from Niusha. And Niusha, you sent in this what appears to be a blueberry branch on your own thigh. When it comes to nature tattoos or branches, you want to keep it feeling organic. You want to clean up your line work because clean lines on a tattoo like this are what's going to carry this tattoo. And the way you can keep it feeling organic is by using a bit harder angles in your line work instead of those soft curvy ones that you're using currently. Now, I'm not saying you have to have super hard 90-degree angles in this tattoo. I just mean maybe having a little jog left in one area and a little jog right in another can take you pretty far. I honestly think that could be a pretty simple and overlooked trick, just throwing in some harder angles every now and again. Now, when it comes to the leaves, you want to try not to have two leaves looking exactly the same. Again, that just brings it back to making it feel more organic. When it comes to this tattoo, most of the leaves do look a lot different, but the two on the bottom look pretty similar. My main issue with these leaves is, although some of the leaves look organic and natural and you can tell which way they're flowing, other ones kind of look like they're just plastered in there because that's what you know to be in a leaf. They don't really have any movement or flow. A way you can achieve that is by following that midrib that runs through the middle of the leaf. McRib? Since those leaves don't have a lot of shading on the inside, you're going to need those interior lines to be strong so it actually shows movement and shape. That doesn't mean those lines on the inside are going to be super thick, as you are going to be using a smaller, thinner needle. But you do need to have confidence when putting in those smaller, thinner lines. If I were doing this tattoo, I would likely use a 9-liner for the outside of the leaf and maybe a 3-liner for the inside. So have a solid game plan before you attack those interior lines, as they are super important. Now, when it comes to the blueberries, they seem pretty flat. There's not a lot going on here. Some ways you can improve that are adding a little bit of black to the bottom or shadowy areas of that blue and blending it into that medium blue. You could even add a little bit of white or light blue on top of that medium blue just to give it a little bit of shine. When you're doing that, you have to know where your light source is coming from so all of your shadows and highlights match up. Now, adding some black to these berries is really going to make that blue pop. Darker tones always make lighter tones brighter. Obviously, you want to add your darker tones first as you don't want to stain your lighter tones. Another way to add some dimension is throwing a couple little drop shadows in here. Under the leaves, right on top of the berries themselves, is going to really give this tattoo some dimension. Again, this isn't necessary, it's just another idea if you want to add a little extra. And since we're going down this rabbit hole, let's add a little bit of green to those leaves. Again, not necessary, but I'd like to see what it looks like. To not get overly complicated, I'm going to designate only one side of each leaf to be the darker side. So just like the blueberries, I'm recognizing the light source and shading in only one side of the leaf, leaving the other side open to allow the light source to hit it a bit more than the other side. Now, something I like to do is when I start shading the light side of the leaf is shading in the opposite direction in which I shaded the dark side of the leaf. I usually like to start with a medium tone and blend it to a lighter version of that, just to offset it from that darker side. I know sometimes it can be scary to add those darker tones, but when we get to those lighter tones, it's only going to enhance those lighter tones by having those darker ones in there. And if we ever see any bottom parts of the leaf, I usually like to make that an entirely different color so it's clear that it's not the top part of the leaf. So I think you have a lot of room for improvement here. You know, maybe you can start looking at organic things, little plants, and figuring out how exactly they're structured. Start looking at lights and shadows and how things come to be. I know we talked about a lot of different techniques here, but these are pretty simple overall, and they can be applied to your work immediately, whether that's your drawings or tattoos. But thank you, Niusha, for sending this in, and I hope that helps. Alright guys, that's going to wrap it up for this week's critiques. I know there wasn't as many this week as there are normally, but I do think we had a chance to dive a little bit deeper this time, so hopefully there was some decent information that you guys could take away from this episode. And as these all were pretty much fixer-upper tattoos this episode, I don't really have a favorite this week, but I do still have a featured artist for you little tat goblins. And that's Jake Gordon, aka Handshake Snake Tattoos. Jake's work truly showcases how much contrast you can really squeeze out of a tattoo. The way his yellows and orange punch you in the face is really crazy. We talked earlier about the relationship between black and those bright tones and why it makes them pop so much. And if this isn't a prime example of just that, then I don't know what to show you. Jake's work is extremely unique. He really knows how to incorporate the heavy blacks with the bright and vivid yellows and oranges to really make things pop. Not only is he a master with contrast, but he adds all these little intricate pieces into his tattoos that show you he doesn't like to take any shortcuts. So head on over to Jake's page, give him a follow, throw him a couple likes, and let him know I sent you. Once again, I'd like to thank you all for sticking around to the very end of the video, and if you guys liked this content, let me know if you'd like to see more of it. And as usual, if you'd like to see your tattoos critiqued on this channel, you could do so by sending them to ponycritiques@gmail.com. Make sure to label whether or not you're an artist or collector, as it just makes it easier for me. Make sure to subscribe, like this video, and share with your friends, as it really does help a lot. And until next week, see you then.